One verse from Paul's letter to the New York City of his time, the city of Rome. Don't let the culture around you squeeze you into its mold, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you may discern what is the will of God for you, what is good and acceptable and right. I grew up on stories. I'll bet you did also. Once upon a time. I remember my grandmother reading me from a little book of Aesop's fables, Remember Brer Rabbit. But the radio in the living room brought me the stories I loved the best. I would rush home from school so as not to miss any of them. Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Captain Midnight. I see some of you shaking your head. I wonder whatever happened to that secret decoder ring. What my grandchildren have missed. And of course the Lone Ranger, and then as I got a little older there was Inner Sanctum and I Love a Mystery. But they're all around us today, the same stories, different names, but the same stories. Some really hang on. E.T. is back, have you noticed? And the Force is with us. And then there's Spider-Man. Beam me up, Scotty. And on television, they run together in a variety of forms. Some of the commercials are the best stories of all, especially those Bud commercials. Soaps and movies and evening news and commercials, one big blur of fantasy and reality with very little boundary in between, all soaked up uncritically and internalized with what I fear is a psychological chaos that is powerful but without much focus. Why are they so important? James Hillman, psychologist, writes, when grandmother tells yet again about the chimney fire that blazed onto the roof and almost burned the house down, and recounts how each member of the family did this and that, the story is boring only if you listen with an ear for fact. But the story is also a lesson about concealed dangers, about protecting home, about family collaboration, and about the character of each of the characters whose styles emerged during the emergency. And why must these stories be told repeatedly? What is the story trying to tell behind grandmother's telling? And why are grandmothers through the ages repositories of stories? These stories, repeated and repeated over and over, show the lore-making, the mythologizing function of our minds, which turns the disasters and celebrations of the family, of the town, of the community into foundation stories that give background and underground to the patternless flow of daily event. By means of repetition, the mind forms significance from the ordinary. It is as if the soul begs for the same stories so that it knows something that will last. Stories, he writes, offer a foretaste of the eternal. Well, if so, it's no wonder that the family of faith lives from stories, told and retold generation after generation, from pulpit, in Sunday school, at bedtime. By means of repetition, the mind forms significance out of the ordinary. For example, when I was a boy in the Lakeside Baptist Church, one of the ordinary realities of that experience was the fact that I was different from many of my schoolmates. I wasn't necessarily happy with that, but if you don't go to movies and dances and you don't hang around with kids that do because you might be tempted, there isn't much you can do about it. You are different. But the Bible stories enabled me to accept that, live with it, even be proud of it, find meaning in it. One in particular, Daniel in the lion's den. I could still see those lions in a circle about poor old Daniel on the flannel board. Do any of you remember flannel boards? Let me replay the story this morning for just a moment. It's a story out of Babylon, present-day Iraq, around the year 520. Darius, a Persian, has conquered Babylon, that ancient people. Darius out of Iran, believe it or not. And he's busy setting up a bureaucracy so that he can maintain control of the new place. He appoints governors over some 120 districts into which he has divided the country that he's conquered. And he names then at the top 3 cabinet ministers to whom these 120 governors will report. Says the old story, to safeguard the emperor's interests. And Daniel, of all people, a resident of Jerusalem who's been exiled to Babylon, is one of those ministers, a kind of displaced Henry Kissinger. He, in fact, was so capable that the emperor actually intended to eventually turn the whole country over to him, which didn't set really well with those other 2 homegrown guys, the other ministers. And they began to look around for some pretext to undermine this foreigner. But they really couldn't find any negligence or malpractice. They realized if there was any way to undermine him with the emperor, it would have to be by bringing a charge against him connected with his rather quaint and curious religion that he brought with him from Jerusalem. They managed to wangle an audience with the emperor. Long live King Darius, their speech begins. That's always a good way to begin when they let you in the Oval Office. We, the ministers of the kingdom, prefects, satraps, courtiers, and governors have put our heads together and have agreed that the king should issue a decree to the effect that whoever presents a petition to any god or human being other than the king during the next 30 days is to be thrown in the lion's den. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed, he retired to his apartment. The windows of his upstairs room faced toward Jerusalem. And he went on in his daily habit of opening those windows toward Jerusalem and praying 3 times. That is, until the thought police knocked at the door and found him at it. And they immediately ran to report to the emperor. Did you not sign an edict forbidding anyone to pray to anyone other than you? The decision stands, the king replied. Then they said, Your Majesty, this fellow Daniel, one of the exiles from Jerusalem, one of those immigrants, disregards both you and the edict which you have signed. So the king, in great distress, but true to his word, ordered Daniel to be brought and thrown into the lion pit, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you have served so faithfully, will just have to save you. And now you know the rest of the story. The next morning, after a bad night's sleep, the king rushes to the pit to discover that indeed Daniel is quite unhurt because he had trusted in his God. And the text concludes, this Daniel flourished in the reign of Darius the Persian. Now come on, do you really believe that story? Did it really happen? Of course it did. It happened to me. Growing up in a faith that was a little different than the culture and crowd around, I, on occasion, felt very much like Daniel in the lion's den. I grew up in a fairly rough neighborhood, actually, although my mother probably wouldn't agree. Wasn't easy, but somehow I managed to keep my window open toward Jerusalem, stay in touch with the faith and values of the home I came from, and I got through it. Actually, I did pretty well when they ceased to make fun of me and came to respect me. Why would a 12-year-old find a 2,500-year-old story important? Because it was his story. We sang in Sunday school, Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. It helped him understand what was going on, you see. It taught him why he should stick with what he believed. It gave him hope that he might beat the lions and come out ahead. I can laugh now, we all can, from perspective of another time and culture, at the thought that dancing and movies are the worst possible sins in the book. If I tried to tell my grandchildren about that, they would laugh me out of the house. But you know, from the perspective of time, I also realize that it was more important that I learn to be different than what the difference was. It was a story that shaped and strengthened a young mind. But more important, this story shaped and sustained a people without whom we wouldn't be here this morning. Daniel is a story about how to keep your identity and faith and wits in an alien culture. It's about a people who've been stripped of their freedom and dignity and dragged off to a foreign land. How shall we sing the Lord's songs in a strange land, is the cry of the psalmist. But they did learn how. Not all of them, but enough. By keeping their windows open toward Jerusalem, by remembering who they were and to whom they belonged, they survived that 50-year exile in Babylon until they could go home again. And the interesting thing is this: it was during that exile that their faith ceased to be mere habit and ritual and began to burn with fervor. Indeed, most of our Bible as we have it, this old book, the stories from which we seek to live and try to pass on to our children, were first put in written form during those 50 years as they sought, in the midst of an alien culture, to stay in touch with their past. They remembered the faith of Abraham and the courage of Moses and the law of Sinai, and they wrote them down so that they might stay true. And if they had not, no Jesus, no Paul, no you, no me this morning. I know it'll sound crazy to you, but we might be worshiping some Babylonian moon god in a culture far more primitive and cruel than the one we enjoy. Because Daniel is the way the faith survives the alien winds that often blow. Daniel is Dietrich Bonhoeffer in a Gestapo jail in Berlin in 1945, standing against the pagan gods of blood and soil at the cost of his life. Daniel is my friend Reinhold Schmidt, refusing to participate in the fraudulent elections of godless communism in East Germany during his 40-year exile there. We need to remember that more Christians today suffer for their faith around the world than in all the preceding centuries back to the beginning. Daniel is the story of Nian Cheng, a 72-year-old Chinese widow woman who now lives in this country, having escaped. But she typifies many men and women of faith who are still facing the lions in alien cultures. When she lived in China, she was at first harangued and harassed, beaten, deprived of home and possessions, then placed in solitary confinement for 6.5 years. A damp concrete cell, no communication with the outside world, barely kept alive on a diet so meager that her gums bled and her hair fell out. Once she was handcuffed for 11 days until her hands swelled, became infected and bloody, all to what end? To break her will and faith. All she had to do, they kept telling her, was deny her faith, her commitment to Jesus and his way, the story by which she lived, and she would be free and with her family again. But she says she did not because it would have been to destroy something within her that was integral to her very being. Out of this experience, she writes some very interesting observations. Is it not true that we all possess some destructive tendencies in our nature? The veneer of civilization is very thin. Underneath lurks the animal in all of us. If I had been brought up to worship Mao and taught to believe in him, I might have behaved exactly as my guards. But I was not brought up that way. So throughout my imprisonment, I turned to my God and knew his presence and strength. In the drab surroundings of the cell, I did know magic moments of transcendence that I had not experienced in the ease and comfort of my normal life. But my belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and goodness sustained me and renewed my courage to fight on. My faith sustained me in the darkest hours of my life and brought me safely through privation, sickness, torture. It enabled me to live from day to day and to do what I knew was right. Because during her exile, she kept her window open toward Jerusalem. She stayed in touch with the story of her God. But what of us? You know, we live neither in a clear-cut exile nor in the promised land. There's much about the culture out there that we can affirm and be grateful for, our tradition of freedom that allows us to worship without fear of harassment, the moral values of our ancient and holy faith that are still honored by many, the reality, I suppose, that 85% of all Americans still profess the faith and nearly half of them say they'll be at worship today. So you see, our picture is much more complicated than life in Babylon or Berlin or Beijing. Ethicist Larry Rasmussen says our society currently lives from moral fragments and community fragments, and both are, I think, being eroded faster than they're being replenished. Ours is a season of moral sprawl and homelessness and drift. That sounds a little like exile. We have to struggle with other pervasive and persuasive stories out there. One story is the romance that there's a reasonable technical solution to every problem, from sex to self-esteem to success. Another story is the Horatio Alger story, which is still very much alive. Work hard, do your best, and you'll get there. I still remember conversations with a friend who finally died of a heart attack. His life had gone from home to Harvard to heady success in the business world, until an unanticipated merger brought his career to collapse, no fault of his. Too late in the game, in his 50s, to recover the course. He did manage a lifestyle change, but not well. It meant the end of his dream. I can still hear him tell me, "Gil, I grew up playing baseball. I might even have made it to the majors." And I always thought that life was a little like baseball. Play hard, play by the rules, and in the long run you'll be a winner. But it hasn't worked out that way. Bet on the wrong story. And I really think that's what killed him. Great guy, I'm not passing judgment, but he had an inadequate story. Or there's the story pumped at us from the commercials and consumer appeals that come at us every day. Buy enough and somewhere along the line you will buy happiness. I mean, it's a silly story on the face of it, isn't it? But tell me then, why are those mall parking lots absolutely full day and night, 7 days a week? Or there's the story our kids hear night and day. Work hard, get the grades, go to the right school, find the right guy or gal, and you'll know life. Great goals, not all bad. But of course it means packed schedules and no time to spend with windows open toward Jerusalem, or so they tell me, or their parents. So it becomes, you see, much harder in the midst of proximate goods and conflicting claims and understandable and even innocent interests and laudable ambitions to stay clear about who we are and where we come from and what we must honor above all else, like honesty and truth and integrity. The miracle of the modern world with all its gifts confronts us with a crisis of religious faith in that it generates confusion rather than persecution, relativism with respect to morality, and depletion of values. For what is religious faith all about, especially Christian faith? It's about a powerful explanatory story that gives meaning to it all, moral guidance for these days, community of ritual and relationship which renews us and gets us back on course again. It gives us a story to live out, standards to live by, strength to live from. And that's what Daniel kept in touch with as he opened his windows toward Jerusalem. A powerful explanatory story that gives meaning and moral guidance. And the problem with all the images and information that flood our eyes and mind is that they offer at best very confused signals. Saw a cartoon the other day, New Yorker naturally. A little fellow was sitting in front of that typical Eastern guru in his underwear saying, "What is the meaning of life?" And the guru is saying, "Sorry, you'll have to come back tomorrow. The computers are down." Science and technology offer us not the slightest clue as to why we're here and what we are to do with our lives. Facts afford no interpretation of reality. Only a word from beyond, a word from God, as it were, can do this. And without this, without a way of understanding reality, we are in deep trouble. Only as we have a firm and abiding way of understanding what happens to us will we really live healthy and purposeful lives. You just cannot improvise your way through life from day to day and make a success of it. And there is a story, thank God, that we must learn, must trust in order to live. And you don't learn it by bare experience or experiment. It's not the product of modern research or therapeutic insight. It's not new at all. You see, to be a Christian means, if it means anything at all, means at least this. It means the judgment that the final and decisive truth about life and how to live it happened already a long time ago, 2,000 years ago. It means the humble acceptance of an old story in faith, that they know more about how to live than any current fads, and only as I place myself under their tutelage will I get it even half right. Only as we stay in touch with the old story and leader, only as, like Daniel, we keep our windows open toward Jerusalem, do we sustain a perspective on reality that enables us to live truly happy and fulfilled lives. In the early days of this century, Howard Walter and John Burgess, both fresh out of Princeton, spent their first year in teaching at Waseda University in Japan. And there they encountered a culture very alien to their past and heritage, but powerful enough to begin to draw them into its habits and ways. And one night, young Walter fell to thinking about where he'd come from and about those waiting for him back home, thinking about what really was important to him in life. And he sat down at a little table and scribbled a few words on a piece of paper. I would be true, for there are those who trust me. I would be pure, for there are those who care. I would be strong, for there is much to suffer. I would be brave, for there is much to dare. And there's Daniel again, opening a window towards Jerusalem, the songs and stories of Zion, of home. And the lions couldn't touch him.